caveat is that I've always kind of found the concept of happiness to be a really elusive one. This is something you're probably running into a lot as well. Means a lot of things to a lot of people, and in some ways can be a not very helpful term. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sure.
Good job.
Yeah. So that said, I generally think of, and sort of the purposes of our magazine, we frame happiness as being more about living a meaningful life, a life lived in compassionate connection with other people, where you have a deeper sense of purpose and connection in your life beyond just sort of fleeting moments of pleasure, with still the understanding that moment-to-moment feelings of positive emotions are really important. Living a life of moment-to-moment misery, even if when you look back in your life you feel like it was a worthwhile, purposeful life, that doesn't quite feel like happiness to me. I think that people might agree or might not, but it's in some ways the combination of the two. Feeling like moment to moment, day by day, even though there are some ups and downs, you're on in general feeling pretty good about yourself, good about your life, but then also looking long term, feel like your life is one of meaning and purpose.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that happiness comes from external cues, or is it something that you're born with and you need to discover, or what would you say?
Well, I'm really kind of influenced because I'm kind of steeped in a lot of the research. I can tell you what the research says, which is basically what I've come to believe or accept myself, which is that so a lot of the research suggests about 50% of your happiness is determined by your genes, and about 10% is determined by your circumstance. So where you might live, whether you're married or not, but about 40% is deemed to be under your control. Something determined by intentional activities that you undertake and skills that you can cultivate over time. And so stemming from that, there's a growing list of suggestions, recommendations, practices that have sort of been generated by and tested by the research for people who want to really kind of maximize that 40% and cultivate intentionally as much happiness as they can, despite, regardless of where their genes may situate them. And that, of course, is on average. There are some people, the 50% figure could fluctuate. There are some people who just genetically have strong predispositions to depression and whatever, much harder time. That 40% isn't really going to come into play quite as much for them. But on the average, that's what some of the research suggests.
As far as the genes go, what biologically goes into the happiness factors?
Good question. Beyond just, there hasn't yet been identified a happiness gene, I guess. There's work kind of along those lines, and work on altruism and empathy fairly recently in the last year or so. Some research finding that people who have a particular receptor gene for the neuropeptide, sort of hormone oxytocin, are more capable of empathizing with others. And then there are some correlations between those types of social connections that can be fostered by empathy and longer-term happiness. And similarly, there's more recent work just out in December, I think, on an altruism gene as well, which isn't quite as dramatic as all that. A lot of these findings, they're sort of incremental, very preliminary findings, but there's some research suggesting that there are some of these biological propensities for, say, altruism or empathy are being determined. There hasn't yet been identified really a happiness gene. That said, there is some research that looks at the biology of happiness. And again, what that means is a little fluid and hard to pin down, because some of the work on the biology of happiness or the biochemistry of happiness, it could be framed that way, but a lot of it is really about pleasure and reward. And it's kind of sort of an open question about whether those feelings of pleasure and reward really constitute true happiness. But along those lines, there's some research suggesting that, a good amount of research obviously identifying certain neurotransmitters, certain regions of the brain that activate when you experience pleasure and reward. And really interestingly, there is a good amount of research suggesting that when people give to others and perform altruism and behave generously, those same regions of their brain activate. So the same regions that activate, when you're doing something really pleasurable and fun, which you usually think of as being something that's kind of self-serving, those same regions activate when you're doing something for other people.
So do you think happiness is like purely a biological phenomenon, or is it like a spiritual kind of soul thing too?
It's a good question. I mean, I wouldn't want to reduce happiness to being just about, your biochemistry. And obviously, there are certain big spiritual questions that the research itself it's never going to conclusively answer in a way that persuades everybody, I think. Because in a lot of ways, I think it's worth saying that what the research suggests, it's hard to say whether a lot of the biological markers of happiness, whether your happiness really comes from those biological bases, or whether those biological markers are just signs of happiness. So meaning, do you feel good because your brain is making you feel good and the neurochemicals are making you feel good? And to a certain extent that is true, but also in some of the brain activity, it's unclear whether you feel that way, whether the brain is simply activating that way once you for other reasons, be it spiritual beliefs, divine intervention, your behavior, is making you feel a certain way, then that's reflected, instantaneously almost, but maybe subsequently in your brain activity.
Mm-hmm. Do you think in order to feel happiness there needs to be a stimulus?
What do you mean by that exactly?
Like, do you think I need to go out and exercise or get a new pair of jeans, or can I just be content with nothing going on? Because it's something that's innate in me.
Yeah. I would say so. I guess it's hard to determine exactly what you would mean by a stimulus, because I think there's a lot of research suggesting that meditation and mindfulness can elevate those positive feelings that we associate with happiness. And in a lot of ways, actually, some of the things you mentioned, exercise is actually a really good example of something that has been really strongly correlated with happiness. But at the same time, spending money on yourself has actually been kind of surprisingly really strongly associated with sadness. And that actually there's some research suggesting that people are more likely to spend more money when they feel sad, and that spending money won't make them feel any happier when they spend it on themselves. And just as for not to get too far off track, really interestingly, there's some research suggesting, albeit somewhat preliminary research, suggesting that when you spend money on others, your happiness does increase, but it doesn't when you spend money on yourself. And as an interesting twist to that, when you ask people beforehand whether they're going to feel happier if they spend money on themselves or on others, they'll say they believe that they are going to feel happier if they spend money on themselves. But in truth, in practice, the reverse is actually true. Getting back to your question, I think it depends really on what the stimulus is. I think there are certain stimuli that really can boost your happiness. I think there are certain stimuli that you may think will boost your happiness but really won't. And I think there are certain practices that are more internal and perhaps contemplative practices that don't require any external stimulus that can really boost your happiness. And all that said, at the same time, there are certain people who have just a more natural predisposition to feelings of well-being, positive emotions, regardless of their circumstance or regardless of any practice or external stimulus that they may undertake.
Mm-hmm.
So we're both taking a first psychology class, and we just learned about emotions and the different theories of why we feel emotions, and there was one it's like the James Lang theory, but it was his hypothesis was most people think, we cry because we're sad.